Alright guys, in tonight's discussion is that we're going to discuss about one of the simplest opening, easy to memorize, but you have to be very particular of the position that is going to arise. Again, the opening that I'm going to introduce is simple to memorize, but you have to be very particular on the position that is going to arise. Now, and what kind of opening am I now introducing? What I'm going to introduce is to simply play d4 at all costs. We're not going to play g3, knight f3, just like in the previous videos that I introduced. I'm going to introduce to you d4, and whether black goes for knight f6, e6, d5, or simply goes for the Slav variations, we have one concrete, easy to memorize opening. I'm going to introduce to you the Colle Zukertort variation. Now, what is the Zukertort variation? The Colle is actually simple to memorize. When white plays d4, whether black plays knight f6, e6, d5, simple to memorize with knight f3 next, e3, bishop d3, b3, bishop b2. Wait whether the knight goes to d2 or c3, we're going to castle. And now we're going to wait later on whether the knight goes to knight d2 or white goes for the assault on the center on e5 and go flank attack on the king side, or white is in the case of queen side expansion with c4. One by one, I'm going to introduce to you when white plays d4, a simple setup d4 in the game of Giza Baruxi versus Joseph Henry Blackbird, played in 1923. Game as follows: d4, knight f6, knight f3. If black plays c5, for example, if your opponent wanted you to enter into the Benoni or modern Benoni, Benko Gambit, we don't entertain main lines. We simply continue at ease with pawn to e3. And if black plays going to play e6, then we still going to play bishop d3. And like I said, easy to memorize opening, but you have to know every detail, how black is going to respond and every move it takes. So d5, now tendency of playing c4. To avoid that disturbance, we're going to play b3. Question: isn't it to play c4 directly? No. The answer there is no. Some other moves, we're going to transpose some kind of the semi-queen's gambit with c4, but I prefer you to play b3. We don't commit playing c4 too early. Again, we do not, if you're going to go for this kind of opening, we don't go for committing playing c4. We're going to play b3, and of course, you have already committed to play e3, and hence this bishop, the dark squared bishop on c1, is asking white where to put him to a much more better square for a good development later on. And the only chance there is b3, developing this bishop on bishop b2, and the hopes of opening the bishop, or the bishop may be here, the bishop may be here, the bishop may be here, but its purpose is to have that kind control, firm control on e5. So black plays knight c6, white goes castle, and now after capture, and that is really not a good capture when after the capture, white has now a semi-open line towards the enemy king. Black continues bishop d6. And now, like I said, we have to continue the control on e5 with bishop b2. And after castle, in this kind of position is what is the real setup of the Zukertort variation of the Colle opening. The point there is, again, we don't play c4 yet. We are trying to go wait and see depending on the details of what your opponent is going to play. Or, if you are really in the mood to play on the queen side, you can actually play with the pawn to c4. But if you are really in the attacking mood, a very aggressive move, then I might suggest you to go over knight e5, knight d2, a3, try to prevent white from playing knight b4, and f4, queen f3, and putting all the pieces towards center and towards the king side. And it has the spirit of the stone wall variation. And that is the concept of the stone wall. Now, let us go over other games now. In the game of Akiba Rubinstein versus Mikhail Chigorin in 1906. The game was as follows for a while. The game was follows for a while. Let me, right? In the game of Akiba versus Chigorin, the game was follows. So like this, d4, d5, knight f3, e6, and like I said, it's an easy to memorize opening. c5, b3, knight c6 castle, and if black plays a6, bishop b2, and if black is going to capture, and it is not really recommendable for black, capture, bishop d6, and now knight bd2, and now white is opting for a stone wall setup with binding e5 followed by f4 and attack towards the king side. Black castles, white now plays rook e1, and I say that rook e1 is actually no longer necessary for white. White could simply play a3, preventing knight b4 later on. And if black is going to play knight b4, white just knight b4 for example, knight b4, white can just go queen e2, bishop e2 I mean, queen c7, then white could play c3 and goes back, and white here can already play c4 since here white is already denied to play knight e5 because of this. White now, like I said, this opening is easy to memorize, but depending on the details of the opening of black's reply, that would lead white either go for the king side or center attack, knight e5, or at this very on point, because white is no longer allowed to go at the center, then might as well go for a queen side expansion. So white plays knight bd2, black did not go for knight b4, instead castle, and rook e1 is still good, but not that good when white can just simply play a3, a prophylactic move, avoiding white to play knight b4. And in case black is going to play e5 because he's going to force shall we say e5, white can just simply go queen e2, which is much better. Why? Because if black plays b6, knight e5, then the rook is already useful on the f1 square when white goes for f4, and this rook on a1 should be going here on e1 to try to strengthen more the center. So white goes rook e1. So what is very important is getting the thought on this position. Bishop d7, and now, like I said, if you are in the mood of attacking and very aggressive on attacking the king side, you might as well go for the assault on knight e5. Black goes for rook c8, and now there is already a threat, and be noticing and cognizant with the threats such as knight b4 attacking c2 and attacking that good bishop. It is very important now to play pawn to a3. Black plays knight e7, and now white plays knight df3. But again, f4 is also worth to consider, going for a flank attack at the king side. Knight df3 is not so that really bad. Still good. Knight df3, black plays knight g6, and now black is now going for a super defense at the king side. When white just simply go a prophylactic move g3, not allowing this knight to go roam around on h4 and f4. So white, black goes super defense with rook e8, trying to go for a rock solid defense, and now white now goes for knight g5. Now, tendency is white is inviting black to weakening with h6 and creates weaknesses on the king side, and just simply have to knight takes, pawn takes, and the e6 will fall. So bishop e7, and now to undermine all black's defense, and remember, one of how to dismantle your opponent's defense is the pawn, because the pawn is one point, and of course high rank officials are very scared with pawns trying to harass black's defense, strong defense on g6 and f6. h4 was the good move. Knight h8, and now white goes for a4. Later on, might be trying to create an idea of eliminating the defender on e7, and after h6, and just what white wanted, to have holes on g6 and h7, white goes knight h3, and having the thought of playing f4, g4, and g5 later on. So the game follows knight d7, not allowing f4, g4 because h4 will fall. Knight f4 is another one, bringing more pieces towards the enemy king. So after bishop b4, just simply c3, and I don't think this capture is correct. Capture, and what do we have here? If that is the case, white just simply sounds like not really capture. Let us try to analyze. Let us go over stockfish. Okay, there's already queen b1 attacking the king. Queen b1, and then there's a plenty of attack. That was really a gambit. The c3 exchange was a gambit after all. But I rather prefer white's rook going to rook g3, followed by g4, and shift the rook towards the king side. So it matters with the taste. So bishop b4, c3, black goes bishop d6, and now white goes for bishop h7 with a mate, queen c2 with a mate of bishop c7, g6, and now because white has sufficient, black has already sufficient weaknesses, creating hole on his king shelter, white now goes for something with a finale with queen d2 attacking h6, g5, and now too much weakening for black's king really is hurting black with knight h3 targeting g5, knight takes, capture, bishop e7, capture, h6, g5, and now infiltrating, and white wins few moves ahead. So that is how you study getting the introductory openings or setups and get the gist of these games. So that is one part of UC when we are going to attack the enemy king with a knight e5 assault followed by pawn and much more pieces deployed towards the enemy king. The second one, which is much more a bit of what you call this, bit of complicated to understand, but in fact it's not necessary, it's not really that complicated. When white plays d4, when your opponent saw you that you are fond of attacking the king side with knight e5, then you might perhaps in the following round change gear with c4. In fact, you can actually play knight e5 here, bishop b7, and now f4. That is no doubt playable and can that. But if you find yourself that your opponent, because this is very important in tournaments, especially in team play, that we do not want to be caught on what we've been preparing of. So it is best we change gear with pawn to c4, and eventually in this kind of variation with c4 is not that kind of simple. Even I am having some troubles understanding this. But what is very important here is the main point of who will surrender these pawns. The perfect timing to surrender those pawns or give up the central control with capture here. Or perhaps may no longer not exchanging as long as you are going to pressure the center with queen e2 or either queen c2, either knight c3, putting knight c3 or knight d2 and putting the rooks on d1 and c1. You're going to wait and see who's going to give up from the pressure on d and c, and when the time is the concrete time to release the pawn with d takes c5 or c takes d5 or hybrid with it with knight e5. So the game went follows with bishop b7, white plays knight c3, castle, rook c1, white is now starting to go for the center, knight e4, and we don't entertain that. We just have to continue queen c2. Let it, like I said, we are going to put pressure on the d and c file and wait and see when to release the pawn exchange with d takes c5 or c takes d5, knight df6, rf d1, and now here comes white goes c takes d4, which is a blunder. Did not see, or black did not see, a simple bishop takes c4, and look at it, like I said, there is a pressure on the queen. He cannot just simply go on like this with d takes c3. When white plays queen takes c3, he cannot play knight takes e4 because of queen takes g7 checkmate, and he cannot just simply go over here when there is a simply rook takes and somehow a wins for white in this kind of position. So I don't think it's going to be good. Queen c7, bishop b1, capture, then white goes for knight g5 for the assault when white has knight takes h7, sacrifice, and goes over with full of attack on the king side. So black plays queen h6, h6, queen c2, attacking. It cannot be done, this one, because of this, and there's queen h7, checkmate. So plenty of booby traps here with rf d8. White goes now regrouping with knight f3, bishop e4, now queen takes c4, capture, 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 and now white is ready for an end game. So king f1, bishop d6, bishop d4, ready for the hanging pawns, and here rook c2, And now here comes g4. And it seems that in this kind of position, white is having a bit of advantage because white is creating a pass pawn, and black is actually having some hanging pieces here, allowing himself not good. So here, and black's king is actually pressured with a mate on rook d8 in this kind of case. So white here is now really winning in this kind of position. See, another game. Yusupov versus Spielman. This is one of straw d4. See, e3 again. Simple to memorize, but yet must understand the theory behind c4. d5. Now, one of the things that you have to remember with the London system, the Colle system on this, is the breakthrough of d5. Whether it's going to enter into the isolated pawn or the hanging pawn, in which case this turned out to be near the hanging pawn, the theory of the hanging pawn structure. Isolated pawn or hanging pawn structure for white in the what you call this, in the Zukertort, is to always keep an eye on pushing on d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, bishop b7, and now white plays e4, black plays c4, white plays bishop c2, and now black plays knight c5, and of course this is actually an advantage for white with pawns, pass pawns at the center, when all you need to do is to first, do not be aggressive. Be very careful of being aggressive, pushing on your pawns, but just solidify with rook e1, overprotect first, and after rook c8, overprotect first, and after bishop a6, and now white now goes for rook e3, knight of d7, knight e2. Like I said, do not be in a hurry. Keep overprotecting your advantage. See, queen f6, white plays rook f3, and now rook e3 continues there. Black may have solidified d3, but is not getting an advantage here. So white plays knight g3. Alright, because there's a slam bang with knight g3, knight f5, capture, and then rook g3. And that's why black is compelled to go king h8, knight f3, and white's pieces, white's knights are getting comfortable spaces, rcd8, and now that bishop is no longer not needed now because it's being blocked by the knights, and it's not getting any closer. So basic in chess, if you see that that is no longer having a bearing on the game, then exchange it with a strong. Remember, this bishop turns out to be a inactive piece. So what's the theory? Exchange your bad piece to his strong piece, which is the knight. Bishop takes, c takes d3, h4, and white is now continuous bombing when white is striking harder here, because black's king is only defended by queen when white has 3 pieces already, and the white's queen can also go over, continue with the attack there. So f5, capture, and now capture, e4, and here comes queen d2, bishop here, queen to f4, capture, knight g5, knight here. It seems now it's already a win for, if capture, check, capture, check, and rook e1, and it's already closer to a win. Rook to f1, queen here, and rest is actually winning for white in this case. So those are the things that you have to remember. Two objectives here: when to play knight e5 and when to play c4. In the next video, we are going to discuss more of the Colle system in this Zukertort variation. But this time, on that next video, we are going to detail more on isolated pawn and hanging pawn situation of the Colle. So stay tuned and stay tuned for the second video of the Colle Zukertort version, but more on isolated and hanging pawns situation of the opening variation.